Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic: David Meisenholder, naming the child predator. Do the dead deserve privacy? Do those who are sexual predators against children deserve to be forgotten, or forgiven, or remembered in nightmares during the day? My human meme friend, today's topic is an ugly one. Uglier even than our recent Sex as a Commodity human meme podcast. And this topic about child predators is especially difficult for me because this topic is personal. And the experience I'm going to share with you spans 40 years of my life. And while my childhood sexual predator did not actually touch me physically, he still exposed himself and revealed his intentions, and the imagery, feelings, and outrage have stayed with me for almost half a century. And now, in the light of day, in the passage of time, and the safety of his death, and in the satiety of my older age, I feel a little bit freer now to finally reveal the depth of the betrayal of my childhood. All in the moment of one morning, in the despicable hands of David Meisenholder. I met David Meisenholder when I was 8 years old in Lincoln, Nebraska. At the time, he was about 50 years old, and he was married without children, even though his wife, Pat Meisenholder, had children from a previous marriage. And I usually don't like to name names on this human meme podcast or in my other writing, because I feel that sort of specificity is too personal and not as far-reachingly applicable in the universal sense of the human experience that I like to try to address. But today, with you, in this sacred moment, I am making an exception, especially in light of the many revelations in mainstream media as men and women step forward to share their harrowing stories of sexual exploitation. And so I have decided the time is now to be specific and brutally honest with me, myself, and others, and to name names, in case there are others out there like me, the unnamed, young and impressionable and vulnerable, from Lincoln, Nebraska, or the surrounding area, who may as well have had their childhood tainted by a child predator like David Meisenholder. David Meisenholder was a local celebrity in Lincoln, Nebraska in the 1970s and 80s. He was a theater producer of note. He wrote theater reviews for the local newspaper. He played the harp and the piano at the local Hilton Hotel on weekend evenings to make a little extra money. And at that time in Nebraska history, if you thought of money and power and entertainment in Lincoln, Nebraska, David Meisenholder was the man to see. He was the center of that storm. And few know that David Meisenholder was also a rat, a paid rat. A rat who would scan the local theater notices in the surrounding area, and then report each play and performance back to the originating rights holder, usually in New York, to score a payment from them for finding these local unauthorized productions where royalties were not being paid back to New York. And David Meisenholder bragged that he mostly worked for Samuel French, outing local theater productions for profit, and in turn getting paid a bounty by Samuel French for being a rat. And then, in turn, Samuel French would send a dunning letter to the theater demanding a royalty payment for their unapproved local theater production. And that letter often bankrupted the local theater company. And the odd thing is that these productions, David Meisenholder was reporting back to New York, were also the productions he was reviewing in the local newspaper. So David Meisenholder was paid on both ends. He'd be paid by the newspaper for writing his review, and then later he'd be paid by Samuel French for reporting the illegal performances. Now, David Meisenholder also gave me my first paid acting job on stage and on television, with his local production of Rover Flies Over, first performed at the Lincoln Children's Zoo. Hey, it was a big thing to be 8 years old and have a paycheck to go with your performance. David Meisenholder was patient. David Meisenholder followed my local acting and performance career for many years, always being there to advise me on all aspects of my growing local celebrity. And he was biding his time until, I guess, I was considered ripe enough to dare a pickling. And since David Meisenholder was married, and at that time in the Midwest, that was enough. That marriage was enough of a protection from any suspicion of wrongdoing or illegal touching of children. Oh, he couldn't like young boys. He's married. And even my mother encouraged my professional relationship with David Meisenholder. Even after we met him several times on the streets of downtown Lincoln, and David Meisenholder was so drunk he could not walk a straight line on the sidewalk. David Meisenholder's early claim to fame, he claimed, was that he discovered Dick Cavett. And he, David Meisenholder, hired Dick Cavett as his magic act assistant. And it was David Meisenholder who moved Dick Cavett from Chadron, Nebraska to New York City today. And that hook that David Meisenholder could do for you, what he did for Dick Cavett, was a powerful lure in the small town of Lincoln, Nebraska. Population 160,000 at the time. And David Meisenholder's last claim to fame, infamy really, was being arrested in a XXX adult bookstore in downtown Lincoln for openly masturbating in stacks. And David Meisenholder's arrest was reported in the local newspaper, the same local newspaper that used to employ him. When David Meisenholder made his move on me, I must have been around 14 years old. I know I was too young to drive because he had to come over and pick me up and take me over to his house. I know it was winter because he canceled 2 times. He didn't want to pick me up with snow on the ground. Then, that day arrived. David Meisenholder had invited me over to his house to discuss my resume and the plans for my next project. And we did that. We had those kind of meetings maybe twice a year since I was 8 years old. So this was really nothing new to me. But that day was new. That day was different. David Meisenholder had also decided, he told me, to make me a breakfast of thinly sliced ham and croissants, which at age 14 I thought was an odd and non-Midwestern sort of menu offering. But I also remembered David Meisenholder was considered sort of strange and eccentric, and I'd seen him drunk as a skunk many times, and so, okay. thinly sliced ham with croissants it would be, and that was the first time I'd seen cold cuts thinly sliced where you could see through them, purchased from a butcher shop deli and carefully wrapped in wax paper. And David Meisenholder told me after we ate, we'd talk about the next steps in my writing and directing career. Okay, then. There was no doubt that David Meisenholder had been a fan of mine. He wrote feature articles about me in the newspaper. He kindly reviewed my performances and original plays for many years. I thought he wanted me to find success, and maybe he did. But I also realize now, in reflection, that he was grooming me for his own sexual desire. And I trusted David Meisenholder. I'd known him for 6 or 7 years by the time he made his move on me. And my friend, this story was previously detailed in a bolesblogs.com article titled A Blind Dog in a Dungeon. And that's the generic telling of this story without the explosivity of naming names. And I will be more specific in this retelling, so some of the facts of that memory may appear changed here, but everything is unchallenged. So, after arriving at his home, his wife was not there. David Meisenholder told me he was going to change his clothes. Okay, weird, but all right. In 5 minutes, he was back in the dining room, wearing a short, silk, flowered, red and orange woman's robe. The length was just enough to cover his genitals, except when he walked or sat down. Then you saw everything. He must have been 60 years old at the time. And I was freaking out, stuck in his locked home, holding my resume while he strutted around the table eating thinly sliced ham and croissants in his flowery robe. I told him I wasn't hungry. He offered me strawberries dipped in chunky sugar. I ate one as he encouraged me to taste that thick sugar. And the next thing I knew, we were downstairs in his cold basement, and he wanted me to smoke some pot, and he invited me to watch. I told him I wasn't really a smoker and that I was allergic to marijuana, and he lit up the pipe anyway and handed it to me. I took a weak toke as he watched me carefully to make sure I held the smoke in my lungs just long enough. I ended up in a coughing fit. His blind dog was wandering in the basement and kept bumping his cold nose into my leg. David Meisenholder packed another bowl. As I tensely sat on the couch next to David Meisenholder, not looking at him and looking around the basement for escape routes, I noticed a small side bedroom with a bed. The stairs, I saw, yes, they were right in front of me. But I felt woozy and confused. Was it the pot, or did he slip something into his special sugar? I didn't know. But I knew, something inside me knew, I had to stay awake. I had to force myself alert, or bad things were going to happen. And they did. Then I heard his voice as I sort of looked over at him, and he'd opened his robe and was masturbating with one hand and toking on his fresh bowl of pot with the other hand. And David Meisenholder's tiny, gnarled, purple penis was grotesque, and I was growing alarmed and extremely angry. And somehow I managed to sputter out, "I need to get home. And I immediately knew that was the wrong thing to say, because I knew he was prone to insane and vicious fits of rage and cursing. But I had to try something to get out of there. He had dead-bolted every door behind us with a key that only he had. The only way out was for me to break a window and to try to climb out, or to try to scream out for help. And I heard David Meisenholder sort of say, "Okay." And we got up and started in slow motion walking up the stairs, and he was behind me. And he said in his nastiest voice, "See, I didn't touch your dick." And I tried to answer him as we stepped upstairs, but I couldn't. And the fact that he'd said dick instead of cock or penis rang in my head as a turn of phrase that seemed oddly functional, intensely personal, but also distant and sterile and esoteric. And I stood there in his living room, shaking, as David Meisenholder changed back into his three-piece suit and drove me home. And we sat there in utter silence as my mind cleared a bit in the fresh, crisp air of South Lincoln. And I vowed if he touched me in that car, I'd slug him straight in the face, even if it meant crashing. And we arrived at my home, and I leapt out of the car, said nothing to him, and ran inside. I never saw David Meisenholder in person again alive, and 20 years later he was dead in 1999. But I have seen David Meisenholder every day of my life ever since. Every day I see him in that creepy woman's robe, with his chunky sugar turning to salt in my mouth. A few years after the initial genitals exposure, I shared my David Meisenholder story with a friend who was a few years older than me, and a friend who was also in theater and movies and TV, and a friend who also knew David Meisenholder, and a friend who had also had David Meisenholder as his mentor. I initially called my friend to read him the newspaper report of David Meisenholder's arrest for beating off and exposing himself in the XXX adult bookstore. And as my friend and I chatted more and laughed a bit, I mentioned what happened to me in David Meisenholder's basement. And my friend, living in California, shouted back into the phone that David Meisenholder had tried the same thing with him. And we were both immediately relieved and furious that we were not alone in that terroristic exposure. And my friend, who got out of Lincoln, Nebraska, and who was successfully working in film and television in Los Angeles, told me he was going to call David Meisenholder right then and confront him. And I said, "That's great, but leave me out of it." My friend said he had to include me because that's the story, the two of us together. And I begged him, "Please do not." I told my friend I still live here, in the same city with David Meisenholder. I hadn't made my escape to New York City yet. And yes, I feared some kind of retribution from David Meisenholder if I were included in my friend's confrontation scheme. Plus, if this story came out in public, I would be tarred as gay and a homo and a pervert. even though I was the unwilling victim. Because, my friend, that's how things worked in the early 1980s in the Midwest. You were guilty by persuasion and convicted by bigotry. It didn't matter that I was straight and had a longtime girlfriend. If all of that came out about David Meisenholder, I would be the fag who deserved everything he got. And as terrible as it is to say now, I was smart enough at that time to deflect and repress just in order to survive. But I was not wise enough back then to realize if this had all come out back then, there may have been other victims who might have stood with me. And maybe all of us together could have prevented other young men who had yet to be exposed to David Meisenholder. And that I regret. I regret I wasn't strong enough back then to dismiss blame and to boldly stand up against a child predator. A child predator named David Meisenholder, who was standing right there in our community square with false hubris of service and belonging. David Meisenholder died, I have always hoped, a broken, exposed man, and his enabling wife Patricia died in 2008. And unwittingly and gravely, I wrote that Boles blog article I previously mentioned exactly 4 months after David Meisenholder's wife died. And now I sort of understand why David Meisenholder's wife always gave me a filthy look every time she saw me. I'm guessing she knew my future, but not what I was in for. Because she knew her gay husband's history of intentions and relationships. And instead of protecting me, instead of warning me away from him, she blamed me for what was going to happen to me long before I ever did. And so, my friend, that is my story, my ugly, inhuman story. No winners, only losers everywhere. And what's the lesson in all of this gutting? Well, I didn't tell anyone. There would have been no point, nothing would have happened. I would have been treated as if I were crazy, or I would have been just ignored. Or worse, I would have been accused of asking for it by seeking his professional help all those years in his role as a man of the theater. And my mother loved the fact that the famous David Meisenholder, discoverer of Dick Gabbett, took an interest in me, a fatherless child of a divorced mother. And going to my mother about what happened to me would not have made a difference. She wouldn't have believed me either. I knew that with her, my mother, that everything was always my fault, and she would quickly blame me for what happened and for embarrassing her with my story. And I'd have to live down being gay from my apron-stringless mother. And that was always her greatest fear in her life, since my father left us, that I'd grow up gay. My mother never protected me from anything, but everything was my fault. And way back there in the history of this moment I've been sharing with you, there were really no viable child predator reporting options. So you did your best, and you stayed quiet and you dealt with it, and you hope nobody ever found out. Because finding out would be impossible to live down such an unearned reputation in a small town. But really, no one would care to want to hear it anyway. And over the years, as I have selectively shared this story, some have argued that I was one of the lucky ones. I got away. David Meisenholder didn't touch me. I won. But David Meisenholder did touch me. Maybe not physically, but he touched me psychically. David Meisenholder touches me every single day. David Meisenholder molested my mind and defiled my memory. David Meisenholder was a monster hiding in the plain open, praised by a community, and seen as a man of high taste and education. And it was a hard thing to stand there back then, near his spotlight, and know the real man. Knowing how, in fact, that tidy monster was right there, hiding behind the blown-out red veins on his ruddy, rusty face. No winners here. Only misery and anger and disappointment. Disappointment that I wasn't brave enough back then to speak out and put him in jail. And I know putting him in jail back then would have been hard, and probably even today, 40 years later. It would always be my word against his. Would others in the community, like me, have stepped forward to share their exposure to David Meisenholder? I think probably not. And I wouldn't blame them for keeping quiet. That's what I did. My friend also escaped David Meisenholder and never confronted him. But what about the others? We know there are others. There are always others. There always will be others. And it is your decision to step forward or not. All this must be in your time and on your memory. And so I urge you to step forward with me now. Step into the bright light of taking back your private life by going public. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.